Coming from the pod to record another episode of Off the Cuff. This week we're lucky enough to have Dr Nigel Fletcher. Dr Fletcher is a political historian, academic and writer who co-founded the Centre for Opposition Studies to promote greater understanding of the role opposition parties play in the political landscape. As a lecturer, he enjoys making sure people understand the importance of politics in the world and the need to ensure there is a fair and cross-party debate on the issues that matter. Welcome, Nigel.
Thanks for having me, Fiona.
It's great to have you here. So, firstly, can you tell us a bit about your political journey and what led you into politics?
I think most people who've been in politics will say it's a bit of an addiction. You sort of get into politics, I think, as a sort of hobby that then becomes more than a hobby. And my earliest political memory was watching the news back in the days when you didn't see the House of Commons on TV. You only heard the sound of it. They would play these clips of MPs in the chamber over a static picture of the chamber of the House of Commons. And I definitely remember thinking, who are those people and how did they get to be there? And then sort of the dramatic time I would have been about 10 or so, when Margaret Thatcher resigned and you had the leadership election, which brought John Major in. It was fascination with the process of politics and sort of Westminster drama. You might remember the House of Cards series, written by Michael Dobbs, and that came along in about, I think, 1990, and I definitely remember being allowed to stay up late and watch that as well. The attraction to me about politics was really about the intrigue of Westminster. It was that, I think, much more than having a sort of burning desire of sort of great political certainties that I wanted to impose on the world. But then, as I went to university and studied politics and just got more and more interested in political theory and political history as well, it was those sorts of things that took me into politics. I worked whilst I was at university as a researcher for an MP at Westminster and just loved being there. It was such a wonderful buzz you got sort of walking around the corridor, seeing these famous politicians. Once you're there, as many people will tell you, you get bitten by the bug and you can't shake it off. I was a university sabbatical officer at the University of London Unions, not as a party politician. We were all elected as individuals then, which was quite interesting. And then after that, I went to work for the Conservatives in the Conservative Research Department, doing education policy, and at the same time went and got myself elected to a local council. I've always had a set of broad political beliefs that I think you would sort of probably characterise as either soggy centrist or wishy-washy one nation Tory. But I think, if I'm honest, the thing that really got me into politics, both practising it and studying it, is the buzz of politics at Westminster.
Has it changed since you first got involved, do you think?
A lot of the ways that politics is done have changed. So the technologies, sort of the pressures on MPs and things like that. But the fundamentals, I think, have stayed the same, like the mechanics of politics and the strategy and things like that you have to employ. I spent many years teaching at King's College London, teaching political history there and the way the Constitution has evolved. And when I talked about Parliament and the way Parliament's evolved, I suddenly realised that I'd seen some of this evolution during the course of my working life. An MP's role is obviously multifaceted. They might be a government minister or a front bencher for an opposition party. They've also a constituency MP, and they've also got any other role they might have on committees. What I found really interesting over the course of the time I've been involved, from the sort of 90s to today, is the way that the constituency role has completely taken over MPs' view of what their job is and what they should be doing. The resources that are given to an MP are predominantly focused on basically helping them set up what is effectively a local social services bureau or a local CAB. They will employ 2 or 3 caseworkers in the constituency. They've got lots of databases and systems set up that will track their casework. And at Westminster, they might have 1 or 2 people there as well. They might have a researcher and a PA. But what has really changed is that you now have a huge weight of the resources are working in the constituency. And so that has an effect on how MPs see their job. They don't necessarily see themselves as making a name for themselves by carving out expertise on a particular issue through long hours sitting through adjournment debates and so on in the chamber. They really are conscious, whether they've got a safe seat or not, if there is such a thing as a safe seat nowadays, they see themselves very much as having to do that constituency work. And it's the casework on the one hand, but also the local media, social media, a huge thing. Wasn't there when I was working there in the 90s. I often say I used to go with my parents shopping on a Saturday and I would sort of disappear off and go to the library. This is how sad I am. This is my William Hague kind of reading Hansard's story. I would go off and read Hansard in the public library. They had weekly copies, bound copies of Hansard. And I would go off and just go and read through what had been happening. And it might actually have been the previous week, or it might actually have been several weeks ago. Before we had regular access to the internet or video on demand, that was actually the only way you could find out what had been going on in Parliament. The idea that I could be sitting here with a smartphone and just quickly look at what my MP is doing in the House of Commons, how they have just voted, and dial up their speech, that really wasn't there. The accountability that MPs have to their constituents is huge now because it's so immediate. And that has changed the way they do the job. Whether it's a good thing or a bad thing you can argue about, it certainly made them more responsive in some ways. MPs back in the day could actually get away with not doing very much for their constituency, and some of them were notorious for it. There are people who, even today, will make a point of being in Westminster for private members' bills on a Friday, and they're not necessarily popular with everyone because they see it as their job generally to block them. But their view is that they are there in Parliament to scrutinise legislation and say, I'm not a social worker, I'm not here to do a local councillor's job for them.
It was actually Eric Forth who said, I am not an overpaid social worker, wasn't it? So again, that shows the age of both of us, really. Do you think it is better now? Do you think that they should be concentrating more on what's going on with their constituencies over what you're actually doing regarding legislation?
Well, it's a balance, isn't it? I think there will have been in the past MPs who frankly took it to extremes and weren't serving their constituents well. There's a great tale of a new MP dragging his huge sack of mail around the House of Commons, finding somewhere to sit, and being taken out onto the terrace by a veteran MP. And he sort of said, I don't know how I'm going to answer all of these. And the other MP had a much smaller packet of letters, and he was just reading his, and he sort of said, it's rubbish, and throwing them into the Thames. And the other MP sort of said, goodness, how do you get away with that? And he sort of said, I do it all the time. I've been doing it for years. And they said, don't they complain? And he said, well, they stop eventually. This idea that, you just ignore things that your constituents, send you. That they sort of said, I don't see it as my job to respond to absolutely every problem that anyone has. I'm here in the cockpit of the nation to guide the affairs of state and so on. But you can take it to extremes, I think, the other way. I think there are some MPs who really do now behave as though they're effectively local councillors, and they do things which really should be the preserve of local government. So to answer your question, has it made things better? I think in some ways it has, because I think now there is basically an administrative system. Every MP is effectively a local ombudsman. There is a bureaucratic system in place, 650 of them around the country, chasing other bits of the state to do better. You could argue perhaps things should be got right in the first place without having to have your MP chase after it. But there is at least a system in place now where if people do have an issue, they can get it resolved.
So alongside the change in the way that MPs work, obviously you have the difference between government and opposition. So you put together the Opposition Studies think tank. What drove that move?
Partly the same geeky fascination with the way politics works. When a party goes from having been in government and then falls out of power, it's suddenly in opposition with very little resources. The change of government was a big thing in 1997 for those of us who were of an age that didn't know anything else. Seeing these people who had used to sort of be ferried around in chauffeured cars and controlling billions of pounds worth of public spending suddenly reduced to queuing for the bus. There was something very dramatic about that. And also, I was by that time involved in Conservative politics to some extent. I helped out in the 1997 general election. And so seeing, the travails of the Conservative Party going into opposition, I found really interesting. And so I did my undergraduate dissertation looking at the Conservatives' experience of opposition under William Hague between 1997 and 2001. And even in researching that, I discovered that there was a real gap in the literature, as academics like to say. There wasn't very much written about the experience of opposition, the structures of opposition, the issues with how you conduct strategy and tactics in opposition, in the way that you would if you were looking at government. You've got libraries of books that will look at every aspect of government. The personality of the Prime Minister, does that impact politics? How does cabinet government work? Bits of the civil service, because we see that as important. When it comes to opposition, Everyone ignores it. No one's particularly interested in the politicians themselves because they're out of power, they're yesterday's people. And so we don't really, as academics or in general, I think, from the media, the public, give enough attention to the opposition. So that's really what drove that move, promoting the study of opposition, to say to other people, this is something we really should be studying. And it's something I still think is undervalued in the literature, in academia, and also in the media. There are certain times of the year or times of the political cycle where suddenly people are taking interest. And of course, after the last general election, last year was one of those times when I found myself getting quite a few media bids and people were quite interested in talking about opposition because the Conservatives were going into opposition. When Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party, that suddenly was quite an interesting story as well. But on the whole, they ignore it and they don't see it as having any relevance, really. But if you're studying politics, if you think that politics is worth studying, you can't understand it fully without understanding the opposition as well.
And of course, it is important to hold the government to account, and you can't do that without a strong opposition.
There are two jobs that the opposition has. On the one hand, they are there to provide that scrutiny role. And on the other hand, they're also putting forward a positive agenda and hopefully putting forward an alternative that they would wish to put into practice. So you've got that government in waiting function. Those two things are both in and of themselves extremely important. The government, as you say, benefits from having a well-resourced and effective opposition because it helps it not to make mistakes if they are having to be alert to the idea that the opposition could be after them. And on the other hand, what the opposition themselves are doing, developing policy for the future, and we don't really study how they go about making policy in anything like the amount of depth that we really should.
And through opposition studies, how do you assess how political parties are getting it wrong?
I try not to be quite so negative. There are different things that parties can get wrong when they go into opposition. And the first of those is that they underestimate the fact that no one is interested. They go from being in government where they've got attention from the media and the public at the drop of a hat because they call a press conference or they put out a tweet or whatever and suddenly it's leading the news because they have power. Suddenly they don't, and they spend a lot of time doing everything other than asking the difficult and fundamental questions about why they lost. There is a real temptation going into opposition to think that it was somehow the fault of their communications or the fact that they were disunited and that they were warring amongst themselves, they were ill-disciplined and so on. All of those things might be true and might have contributed to their defeat, but there is a reluctance to face the uncomfortable truths about what it is that people don't like about them and why they were rejected. It takes them a long time to really learn the lessons, to really sort of work out why it is that they were out of favour. And the other thing, which is I think quite a timely one, there's also an assumption that the election in which you lose power is the worst it's going to get. And, to coin a phrase, things can only get better. That's not always true. In fact, it's very often not true. And in 1983, of course, the Labour Party suffered an even worse defeat than they suffered in 1979 and almost got overtaken by the SDP Liberal Alliance as the second party in British politics. The vote share was very close to that happening. And so the election after the election where you lose can be a really defining moment. It's either the point at which you start making some incremental gains and start the long road back, or it can be an even worse defeat. I think looking at 1997 and then 2001, William Hague was judged to be a failure because he achieved a net result of one extra seat. Basically, the party went nowhere. I think another way of looking at that result, to be kind to William Hague, is that he avoided them going backwards and actually doing even worse. It's perfectly possible that the Conservative Party could have done worse at that election. It's perfectly possible when we see what happened under Ian Duncan Smith after William Hague, they could have gone backwards then. And in fact, that was the great fear. We can look again at Jeremy Corbyn. More recently, Labour Party recording its worst results since 1935 under his watch, having done surprisingly better at the previous election. It's not a steady climb out of opposition. It's one of the big fallacies that people seem to have about the political system and the fact that we have this sort of two-party system, or what's become known as a two-and-a-half-party system, which is also now a bit obsolete, that you have a kind of pendulum effect between the parties. One party goes out of power, then the tide turns and it comes back in again. It's not a given that you will come back. The fact that we haven't seen huge changes in our party system in the UK over the last 50 or so years doesn't mean it can't happen.
And I was going to ask, obviously, with the rise of reform, do you think that that is going to influence how opposition parties work now?
The impact of reform, an extra parliamentary movement that has broken into Westminster, has been having a huge impact on our politics for a long time now recording huge opinion poll ratings that are in and of themselves driving the discourse and the discussion of politics. The fact that the Prime Minister made a speech directly seeking to counter Nigel Farage and Reform's agenda, that has changed the opposition dynamic. You know, you have a government that is fighting not the second party in our politics, not even our third party in Westminster, the one that's sitting there with 5 seats. And it poses huge problems for the conventional opposition parties. The Conservative Party is His Majesty's official opposition. They should be the ones who are there challenging the government as the alternative government. And yet, as I say, the Prime Minister is kind of looking over their heads at what he sees, perhaps at the moment, as one of the biggest threats.
We've talked a lot about parties in opposition. Cross-party politics is important as well in order to collaborate and get things done. Do you think it's easy for political parties to work together for the good of the electorate?
It's not as easy as I think some of them might like it to be. And you'll know this from working with politicians of all parties. On particular issues, particular campaigns, politicians are very good actually at working in a cross-party way. But there is such a degree of tribalism in party politics. There are barriers to doing it. It's a first-past-the-post system. We don't look favourably, traditionally, on coalitions. When you have a system that's based on politicians facing each other across the chamber that's 2 sword lengths apart, it doesn't scream cross-party collaboration and working together. The fact that we haven't solved the issue of adult social care in this country is almost directly attributable to the fact that it has become a political football, which neither party of the 2 main parties of government over the last few decades has been able to take the politics out of. Both parties, Conservative and Labour, have been guilty of accusing the other of all manner of taxes and things when they tried to reform social care. You know, Theresa May had her issue at the 2017 election. Prior to that, the Conservatives attacked Labour for wanting to introduce a death tax. Any attempt to solve that very pressing and serious public policy issue has been thwarted by excessive partisan politics. But I think if they get things done, they might find that people are a bit more accommodating to it.
As there's been the rise of online news, got the rise of the podcast, and you are a fellow podcaster as you run the OppositionCast podcast. So what made you decide to start up?
Well, I think like almost everyone who started a podcast in the last 5 years, lockdown played a huge part. We established OppositionCast in 2020. I think it was about March 2020. And it was initially because we couldn't hold events. As the Centre for Opposition Studies generally have panel discussions or public lectures that we would host. When those things weren't possible, we were all sitting working at home. We launched the podcast then as a way of being able to speak to interesting people and talk about opposition and bring that sort of content to an audience without being able to do it in person. That's how it started. Over the years, we had some very good interviews with people who've had experience of opposition on mainly the UK, but we've also spoken to people about American politics and other parts of the world. We've talked a bit about the opposition in Russia, as some episodes I particularly enjoyed doing. But now it's sort of become an output in its own right, and as I'm sure you're discovering it, it's a really good way of having discussions with people on particular issues and being able to have a bit more time to explore some of these things and bring those to an audience. Podcasts fulfill quite a good role of allowing people to review a library of content that they might not have been able to get to in person.
I was going to ask next, how do you think podcasting is going to influence the world in the next 5 years?
I'm not sure about podcasting in and of itself. I think what is encouraging about it, that I find really good, is that in every other sort of sphere of the online world, we've been shortening our attention span. Everything has gone from reading sort of large amounts of text down to smaller and smaller sound bites. Everything seems to be getting shorter and less detailed. And then suddenly we have an explosion of content that is generally long form. This is the absolute reverse of TikTok, where a few seconds of content and very short videos. And yet at the same time, we have the rise of the podcast, where people will download and listen to people like me, or dare I say you, and your guests, talking for hours. You build up a library of content of discussions that are largely unedited. I mean, there is some editing that goes on. I hope so anyway, because I've been going on for a very long time during this interview. But actually, it is something about a podcast that people value, is that long form, that it's a longer discussion. In a world where there's less and less nuance, and we are getting more and more polarized in our views and in the options presented to us, and dare I say it, in the sort of opposing political forces, I think it's a good thing that we are getting more podcasts on different subjects and things. It's become a bit of a running joke that, there's too many podcasts and so on. Well, people will want to pick and choose what they want to listen to. And I think it's quite a good thing that people are interested enough in listening to issues being discussed in detail to want to listen to them. And so I hope that is, if it's going to influence anything, I hope it influences the way that politicians judge their communications. That it doesn't need to be constantly getting shorter and shorter and less nuanced, more and more polarised and sloganeered. I think they can take from podcasting that people do appreciate a bit of nuance and a bit of detail in discussions, that you don't need to always give them a 10-word slogan. That might be a lofty ambition for podcasting, but I think it certainly is a trend that I think is a positive one. It's like the fact that, everyone predicted books were going to die out. People wouldn't read novels anymore. People wouldn't, and actually they are. Podcasting is one sign of a perhaps more intelligent and nuanced electorate. And I think politicians should perhaps take that to heart a bit and perhaps judge their communications accordingly, that people are not always looking for easy answers and simple solutions. And going back to why I think podcasting is great, it builds up this library of these discussions, which are pretty timeless. You can go back and listen to some really fascinating discussions, as I have on some of yours, gone back and listened to them. And it's just really useful to have that sort of growing library of interesting people talking.
Coming back to your own personal podcast, which episode or guest has been your favourite and why?
I started doing it on my own, as you are, getting guests on to talk about their experiences and so on. And then when we got to the election campaign, and I approached Sarah Southern, who I'd worked with in the past, a great friend of mine who'd been involved in politics for many years, and who had taken a rather strange pivot into going to being a stand-up comedian in the in the interim since being involved in politics. Very funny, very engaging, and as I say, a very good friend of mine, and said, would you like to co-present the podcast during the election? Because I thought we're not going to be able to sort of get regular guests twice a week or something if we're covering politics and the campaign in detail. And it's been great. Although she's not a guest, I'm going to say my favourite person on OppositionCast is, of course, my co-host, Sarah.
And coming back to recording your first episode, what was that like, and how do you think your own podcast has evolved since then?
I did listen back to it some years ago after we'd been doing it for a while, and I can tell you the first episode was pretty terrible. Just on a technical basis, the sound quality is awful, the levels are wrong. I keep wanting to try and find the original audio so I can just remix it or something and put it up, because it bugs me that it's there. The other thing I noticed is that I treated it at the very beginning, I think, like a radio show, like kind of Radio 4, serious, very sedate and austere. I had a very sort of stagey sort of voice in it. And as time has gone on, it's become much, much more conversational and informal. And I think this is one of the hallmarks of podcasting. It is different to doing a radio show. I like listening to radio shows. I like listening to, The Reunion. But I think what's distinctive about podcasting really is that it is a bit more conversational. And as time goes on, I think you get much more comfortable, to the extent that, as you're discovering, trying to get me to stop talking is a really difficult thing. Part of that is being an academic, though. I am now used to, after many years of teaching, can just be told to sort of start talking about a topic for 50 minutes to an hour and just do it.
It feels more like it's in your sitting room. So if you had any advice for newer podcasters like myself, what would it be?
Well, I wouldn't presume to give you any advice, Fiona. You're doing very well. Doing very well. So I've had some fantastic guests on your podcast recently. I think I need to take tips from you on booking people. But I think to anyone who's launching a podcast, the important thing is have an idea of, what is it that you're seeking to do? What is your particular take? I think that having an intelligent conversation between two people, whether those are the hosts or a guest or whoever it is what people come to a podcast for. They want someone who's either entertaining or who is telling them something they don't know already and is talking about it intelligently, and see what works. There's lots of opportunities to play around with different formats and things.
And finally, do you feel positive about the future?
Well, that's a very big question. I think, in general, yes, I'm an optimist, and so I try and feel positive about the future, even in a world which is really very scary at the moment in certain respects. Whilst there are huge challenges in politics, and I think huge challenges to our political system, I think sometimes people like me who care about sort of the way politics works and political systems and so on can be a bit too much of a doom monger. I have been, over recent years, quite alarmist about some of the things I've seen happening in politics and to our political system. And I was having tea with somebody the other day who, when I went into my usual spiel about, how things were really worrying and terrible, basically sort of stopped me in my tracks and said, hang on a minute, and explained to me their analysis of how they thought this was actually going to get better and blow itself out in the years to come. And I think it is worth sometimes, those of us who are sometimes alarmed about what's happening in politics, to remember that things can get better. And one of the ways that they can get better is because people are often much more intelligent than we give them credit for. Politicians often just talk about the people or the electorate as a big lump of people. These are people with their own minds, their own intelligence, but also with their own values. And I think that the public, the electorate, are the ones who actually act as a corrective in the end to some of these things. And as long as they are able to exert an influence over politics, then I think things will be okay. Sometimes when we give in to a bit of negativity, we should be challenged, like the person the other day did.
Yes, absolutely. So the person you were having tea with, they were your opposition.
That's a very good point. Yes, absolutely. That's exactly why opposition matters, because having your own views challenged on a regular basis is a good thing. It makes you think more deeply. It makes you examine your own thoughts and feelings. Yeah, absolutely right. Yes. I knew there was a moral to this story. Yeah, that's the value of opposition right there.
Nigel, thank you so much for coming to talk to us today. It's been most interesting to hear about how important it is to hold government to account and have a good opposition, because any government left unchecked by weak opposition is just asking for trouble. And thank you to the listeners who've hopefully enjoyed the show as much as we've enjoyed making it. If you have any questions regarding the podcast, please feel free to comment. If you think it's worth coming back, please like and subscribe. If you feel you need something to tide you over to the next podcast, please buy my book Party Games on Amazon. And on that note, I'll see you next time. Hope you have a good week, one and all.